Now, of course, as we come into the end of this month, we got some things that we're very excited to have coming forward, and we're going to be sharing that through of course, our email listing. So whenever you receive an email, we definitely invite you to look into some of the things that we're sharing. And then we have a listing on Google, family, and we ask that you look into that and give us a review, especially for those who have gone on the bus tour, because we're trying to build up our, our site, and we're trying to make people aware of the things that we are doing and build our community. So please take an opportunity if you have to do that. Now, in the chat, family, just give us a shout out. Let us know where you're coming from this evening, and so we can, of course, raise you up and let you know that we appreciate your presence here. And then we're going to be moving, of course, very soon, very quickly into the presentation and just the conversation. So
Indeed.
That's what we're going to do. Go ahead, my brother.
Well, let me, because I haven't been here so long, people probably wondering who I am. So at least let me introduce myself. Peace and greetings to you all. My name is Born Logic Allah. I'm the co-founder of Melaneyes Media. For those of you who have never met me, most people just call me Logic for short. It's an honor and pleasure to be here this evening celebrating Juneteenth. This is a monumental occasion. And when you think about emancipation and freedom, because that's honestly what I really think about when we talk about Juneteenth, is the freeing of our people and our struggle, not only to get free, but to continue to be free. In today's world, that is an ongoing challenge. And so with that being said, it's our honor to be able to just have a open dialogue and conversation tonight. That was really the goal, just kind of popped up. We didn't really want to have too much planned, but just really wanted to say peace to the family and spark a conversation. It's a lot surrounding Juneteenth. We've been teaching about Juneteenth all month, so just wanted to be able to share some of that information with you all too. And like Baba Aundar said, for those of you who are with us, go ahead and type in the chat where you're coming from, your locality, whether it be your city, state, or country. Since we've been coming together online, we've been able to garner an international audience. We've had people join us from the UK, from Canada, from Mexico, South America, and of course here in the US, even Australia. I remember we had some pretty staunch supporters who were coming through pretty regularly from Australia.
Sure did.
And so if you all wouldn't mind letting us know in the chat where you're coming from this evening and where you live at. I see we have a veteran, Ms. Clark here from San Antonio. Greetings and peace. Thank you. Jackie from New Jersey. Excellent. The East Coast. Happy Juneteenth, a veteran from San Antonio. Excellent. We appreciate our veterans. And once again, for those of you who are in San Antonio, we do have the Black History Bus Tour that Baba Aundar was mentioning coming up this weekend. I see New York is in the house. NY. Thank you, NY. Tiffany Brown from Austin. Appreciate you. Thank you so much, Austin. And so, like I said, Baba Aundar and I have, well, first off, let us say that we went to the TV station this morning. It was a good occasion. Had an opportunity to speak with our local news station just about the importance of Juneteenth, but also our film, Understanding Juneteenth. And so if anybody has anything that they want to discuss or any questions, anything that you want clarity on, anything that you just want to point out that you think should be emphasized when discussing Juneteenth, let us know. And if you don't, that's fine too, because we definitely got a whole spiel for you if you don't. However, we really just wanted to open up the floor with a conversation in case you all had thoughts on your mind. So when you think about Juneteenth in general, Baba Aundar, what's one of the main things coming to your mind?
It's so much, brother. Now, one of the things I definitely think we should, Juneteenth is very important because it's a celebration of our freedom, liberation. And to me, it's a celebration of our journey towards self-determination. So Juneteenth I think it's a beautiful celebration, and we should continue to celebrate Juneteenth. But one thing I think we've, of course, been emphasizing, and I know I've been saying quite often, is that education must be a part of our celebration. We cannot permit the celebration continue to expand and grow and not be educating ourselves, our young people, so they can continue to understand the importance of this celebration when it comes to our freedom and liberation and self-determination. So I think as we continue to find ourselves celebrating somehow, some way, if it's within the family or in the community or nationwide, we must emphasize the importance of the education. And I think this evening, some of the things that we're going to highlight within, this conversation, at least from our perspective and from my viewpoint, is some of the things that sometimes we overlook. Because, we're supposed to be celebrating family celebration. You're going to have food, you're going to have music, you're going to have entertainment, you're going to have fun. And that should be part of the celebration. But we need to understand why we're celebrating and how this celebration came into existence. And therefore, we don't lose its origin and lose its direction, because we don't necessarily, in one of our presentations, we talk about Memorial Day and its origin in Charleston and how it was very much started by African Americans, and honoring those Union soldiers who had died there, been buried in unmarked graves, and how the African Americans in that community came together with others to, to lay out the grave site, to build a white fence around the grave site, but to start what we know of today as Memorial Day. And, so basically saying that as part of the education, we have to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the celebration. And a great part of that is continue to educate and know the origin and share that with future generations.
Indeed. So with that being said, family, what we're going to do, we're going to switch to our deck and we'll just kind of go through some information here through the slide deck, and we'll present what we have. If you have questions, comments, feedback, let us know. We'll be monitoring the chat. We encourage your engagement. That's part of what we enjoy the most. And so once again, just a brief history, really just wanted this to be a community conversation in regards to Juneteenth, Emancipation Day. And so we know that Juneteenth was made a federal holiday, June 17th, 2021. That's when the bill was signed. It is the oldest known, June 19th is the oldest known celebration commemorating the emancipation of enslaved Africans here in America. And so in this photo, you see a group of men and women, distinguished men and women from Austin, Texas. This is from the year 1900. Thoughts on this, Baba Aundar?
Every time I see this picture, brother, I'm always uplifted and inspired, first of all, to see how dignified we look coming out of slavery and how we felt it was important that we dressed our best and acknowledging the celebration of this day. So I think is something that should be, of course, encouraged, continue to follow in that tradition. But the other thing I really thought about, brother, was that now Juneteenth, of course, is a national celebration now. But can you imagine, as a matter of fact, the first celebration was held, I think, in 1866, the following year from 1865. And that would make it, about 158 years of celebrating Juneteenth in various communities in Texas and across America. So I think a part of that, we want to make sure that we continue to raise up the fact that before it became a national holiday, this holiday was a holiday in the heads and hearts of the people in the community. And this was being celebrated because we understood the importance of this day.
And so as we continue on, we're going to look at the summer of 2020. Now, one of the reasons that we highlight the summer of 2020 is because this is when a lot of Americans found out about Juneteenth. And so when you talk about the international protests and uprisings that took place that summer in regards to the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Mr. George Floyd, these instances really caused an uproar here in the US and abroad. And so because a lot of these uprisings took place in June, there was extra special attention given to Juneteenth. And and so with that extra media attention, it really became a teaching moment because once again, emancipation had been celebrated for over 150 years, but many in America outside of the Black community still were really unaware of it. What's your take on that, Babanda?
Well, brother, I'll ask you because this is a conversation we had, and it was centered around during the uprising in the sense of the protests. Was it, why at that particular time was there a need for the nation to establish Juneteenth as a federal holiday? From the community and voices of the community, some people felt that it was almost to appease, it was to cause a settlement, a calm, and to get people, redirected and focused towards something that they were receiving from, the federal government, the nation. Mm-hmm. But the question is, at the time we was talking about, I think, summer 2020, police reform. Of course, some people was raising up, still the issue of reparations. So it was a lot of things that was being talked about, but this is what was, in a way, offered and given. So I would ask you, what's your thoughts on that, honey?
Indeed, it's definitely a widespread belief that a lot of it was guilt, that the federal government felt guilt for not being able to pass any substantial legislation in regards to police reform or anything that would change the minds of the people. So to appease the Black community, they made reparations a federal holiday. Now we know that had been a push for over 40, 50 years, but no action had been taken. But the moment people took to the streets, you all of a sudden now see the holiday become, approved federally on the federal level. So it's really something to be aware of. It's really something for us to think about. Of course, it's great that it was acknowledged. However, we can never forget that there was a push far before 2021 to really have this be recognized. Mm-hmm. And so, with that being said, I want to ask you all a question, and you all let us know in the chat. How many protests do you think took place? How many uprisings and events do you think took place in the summer of 2020? Let us know in the chat. Give us your best guesstimate of what you think. How many protests and uprisings took place in the summer of 2020? All right, I see 1,000.
Be right back.
All right. Anybody else? Don't be shy. We definitely have to engage. That makes the night go quicker. I see 1,000. Anyone else? So the summer of 2020, and we're just speaking about here in the US because we know abroad there were also uprisings and things taking place in other countries. However, we're really just talking about the US at this point. And so I'll tell you the true answer. According to the US Department of Homeland Security, there were 7,305 separate events that took place in response, once again, to the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. So over 7,000 events, and that's being clocked by the Department of Homeland Security. So we know that's accurate. Thoughts on that, Aundar?
No, that was amazing, brother. When you had shared that information with me, like many others, I didn't realize it was that many. But then you start to think about, brother, that was a hot summer and people was out in the streets. Of course, here in San Antonio, that was protesting, marching. So I would imagine that throughout America and all the cities, pretty much across America, it was taking place. So I can see, the number being real.
And so, when we talk about Juneteenth, one of the things that, I mean, we have to discuss, that we have to talk about, is the enslavement period. We can't have emancipation if we don't have bondage and things of that nature. And so, one of the things that we've been pointing out this month when we teach on it is that, there was a divide to some degree. The North, of course, wanted to make sure that as the U.S. started to expand into the West, these new territories that were being founded, I would say, weren't slaveholding states. When you talk about the West, you talk about the Oregons, the Californias, New Mexico, Idaho, and as they started to expand westward, there was a conversation: will these be slave-holding states? And so the South definitely wanted to continue the institution of slavery. And so there was a battle taking place in the U.S., a culture war, you could say. What's your take on that, Babando?
I think it is important to acknowledge that the nation divide there. Now, what was all in the background for what they was fighting for, I think sometimes we have to be clear on, it wasn't just a moral issue, if it was a moral issue at all. It was more of a control issue, finance, economic issue for America. So I think as we go further into this dialogue, we're going to see that, what I'm thinking and what I realized, two things, and I want to ask you this, brother, is that I know in the presentation, one time you made it, one thing you used to make it very clear that we were not talking about slaves, we were talking about enslaved Africans or enslaved, African people, because I think that was very important. Because, I mean, we're looking at slavery in the Civil War, and sometimes we just think of as slaves. So I would like for you, if you would address that. But also just the idea is that, was it just the fact that true Northerners was looking at how they wanted to not have slavery expand into the Western, these new nations that was being, these new states that were being established, but also, it wasn't always about the moral issue of slavery. It was a struggle between northern whites and southern whites, not necessarily on the issue of slavery, though it was part of that issue.
Well, one thing that really was the issue was the power in Congress, because Southerners were misrepresented by their population. So when you think about the fact that, you got your senators, every state gonna have two senators. But when you got the House of Representatives, that's based on population. And so because the Southern states were allowed to, and this go back to the 3/5 compromise, because enslaved people were being counted as 3/5 of a person, that was adding to the Southern population. Even though these people were not able to vote, that representation was still being powered in Congress with the House of Representatives. So this is one of the reasons why the North was really upset about this, because now you have these Southern plantation owners. They wield a lot of power because they have the representation of the enslaved Africans that kind of count towards their power. And so that was definitely one of the things. Also, the amount of money that was being made in the South, people were getting very rich. And in the North, factories and the Industrial Revolution was just starting to bubble and just starting to happen. And more of the factory work was what was earning people's pay in the North. But in the South, cotton production was booming and they were getting rich. I mean, if we really being honest, so the amount of money that was being made in the South, the representation in the House of Representatives was an issue. So this is really what started, that conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you spoke about it, Bob, I know you asked me to speak about it. It's important for us to remember that slavery was the condition of a people, not the definition of a people. So we don't ever want to just define our ancestors with slavery, with that tag, as if that's all they were. They were skilled laborers, they were artisans, they were teachers, doctors, even in the state that they were in. And so we have to always represent them properly and make sure that we're acknowledging their worth and value.
Point. Excellent. See, Ms. April saying condition of a people, not a definition of a people.
Indeed. And so I did want to share this, brother, because I realized Miss April shared with me that the link was saying 11 p.m. as opposed to 8, and that might have derailed some of our traffic here. So I'm trying to send out emails as best I can, and if people complain, and I'll try to with the cell give them the link.
Okay, I understand.
But as we continue, if we're going to talk about enslavement, we definitely have to speak about the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it was issued January 1st, 1863, and this was during the third year of the war. And if you really read the Emancipation Proclamation, it states that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforth shall be free. And I know we got a little video to kind of go into that a little more in depth. However, what's your thoughts when we really bring up the Emancipation Proclamation, brother?
I think it was a good piece of paper. I mean, it was an idea that it spoke that all persons held as slaves within rebellious state. Now, when you read it, and I mean, Emancipation Proclamation, I know we put a lot of weight on this piece of paper, but the idea to me, what it reads and when it says within the rebellious state, because we know history says that, I mean, it was 1860, South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union. Shortly after that, you had now the establishment of the Confederate States of America. So now you got a whole nother country. So by the third year of the war, you got two nations fighting against each other, basically, because they had their own president, Jefferson Davis, So Lincoln issues this Emancipation Proclamation, and it's supposed to have an effect on the rebellious state, which they have now no control over this other nation. So in many ways, it was a war plot. It was basically saying that a way to inspire people, I think, to encourage people to struggle for their freedom, because what was also happening at that time, Blacks were not necessarily engaged in the struggle to the extent they would after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. And you had enslaved Africans who were still in the South, very much upholding the economy of the South, But when this Emancipation Proclamation came through, Black people took greater action in freeing themselves, running away, and, seeing really the downfall of the economy in the South, which then also gave Blacks an opportunity, of course, to go gain their freedom in a sense, and then join the Union and fight for their own freedom. So again, it was a great piece of paper because I think it did inspire people to do certain things, but in its writing, it really wasn't, it really didn't speak, well, I put it another way, in a positive way. It just was an opportunity to inspire people, and it really didn't have any effect on, the Southern states.
Indeed. And I see that Miss Brenda Clark has her hand raised.
Oh, let me come off can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm from South Carolina. It's good to be online again from Charleston. And when I think of the Emancipation Proclamation and what happened during that time, people have their feelings about what the Emancipation Proclamation did, but I have to agree with you is that it was a good piece of paper to get things started. And when you talked about the rebellious states, in effect, what South Carolina did when it succeeded from the Union, the first state to secede from the Union, first state to print its own money, first shots of the Civil War fired right there from Charleston Harbor. What they did was they committed treason against the United States government, basically, if you look at it that way. And, particularly with all the things that went on January 6th. Another thing with the economy, when you look at the economy of the South, places like Charleston and Atlanta, I mean, they were, particularly Charleston was, the seat of wealth in the South. When they wanted to talk money, that's where they came. The as history goes in Charleston, that whole financial area, if you ever been to downtown Charleston, the whole financial area down there, they say that Wall Street was patterned after that.
Mm.
And there was plenty of wealth down there built on, of course, slave labor, or, the labor of enslaved people. So yeah, it's like the Emancipation Proclamation for its time, when it freed the states in the rebellious states, and that's a real important word after I thought, it was catching them people that actually committed treason against the United States government. I mean, basically is what happened when they pulled out.
Mm. Yes.
That's, when you look at it that way. Very interesting history, real interesting discussion. But yeah.
And the other part of that, Ms. Clark, is that it was still those border states that still had enslaved people in the border states.
Yeah.
So talk about Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, you had enslaved people, but they're still part of the Union. So you're not freeing those people. You're saying that you're freeing people in the states that are no longer a part of your nation.
Exactly. That is exactly what happened. So it's funny how that in the wording, it's funny how that went, but interesting history. Very interesting.
And that really brings us to our next point, which is illustrated by this short video that we have. So we're going to watch this short video just to speak about, the Emancipation Proclamation and the effect that it truly had. So let's go ahead and watch the video.
Abraham Lincoln was determined that the nation was not going to fall apart on his watch. During the first year, the Confederate Army had won a majority of the important battles. In Lincoln's first inaugural address in 1861, he told the Confederates that, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the United States where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." These words had no effect on the Confederate States, who still pursued their efforts to become an independent nation. With no hope of bringing the South back into the United States by protecting slavery, Lincoln, while being pushed by some in his party, moves to abolish slavery. The problem with abolishing slavery, however, was that there were still 4 slave states that had not seceded from the United States: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Lincoln feared that if he advocated emancipation, he would provoke those states into joining the Confederacy, making the war even more difficult to win. When Northern forces invaded the South, black men and women escaped from bondage and ran to the U.S. Army lines, seeing the soldiers as liberators. Lincoln and the Republicans saw this as an opportunity. At first, the Army had no idea what to do with the massive influx of formerly enslaved people, referring to them as contrabands, since they were still technically considered property. Some commanders found them irritating and treated them horribly. Others saw this as a bonus. Losing enslaved people not only demoralized white Southerners, it also deprived them of their labor force, meaning the South would soon run out of food and supplies. When writing the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln was sure to make it clear that the freeing of enslaved persons would only apply to enslaved people in the 10 states in rebellion, ultimately excluding those 4 border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. Proclamation 95, as it was also known, was a presidential proclamation and an executive order issued by the president on September 22, 1862, which was to go into effect January 1, 1863. Texas, being so far west and isolated geographically, planters and other slaveholders had migrated into the state from eastern territories to escape the fighting, and many brought enslaved people with them. Increasing by the thousands, the enslaved population in the state at the end of the Civil War had grown significantly.
And so one thing, you know, that was mentioned in the video was the 4 border states that you all talked about. But you know, the one thing I often think about was the fact that there wasn't very much fighting in Texas. Texas, you know, right before this was an independent nation, a major slaveholding nation when it was on its own. And a lot of Southerners felt comfortable bringing enslaved people to Texas as the battle started to infiltrate other areas of the South. So Texas became almost a safe haven for enslaved people, or for people that were looking to enslave or hold their enslaved Africans. They wanted to bring them to Texas to kind of keep them in bondage. And that's the reason why the population, the enslaved population, jumped so dramatically from the 1820s and 30s into the 1850s. And so when you get into the time of the Civil War, by the 1860s, it was stated that there were over 250,000 enslaved people in the state. Now, before we move on, I wanted to pause, Baba Aundar. Did you have anything you wanted to add on as far as just dealing with Texas or what we saw from the video?
The thing that kind of caught my attention in the video, though, was first Abraham Lincoln, because I think, you know, going to school, many times we hear about Honest Abe, and in a way, he's presented and represented as an emancipator of enslaved people. And I think we have to be more honest about Abraham Lincoln's position when it comes to Black people. I mean, according to him, I mean, if to save the Union and you can maintain slavery, do that. If you to save the Union and end slavery, we'll do that. But the main point is to save the Union. And then he made it very clear he wasn't about equality between Blacks and white, you know, because he said if there's going to be a position of superiority, he wants the white to have that position of superiority. So I think, you know, we have to raise him up for what he did do, but we also have to know the full story and understand that Abraham Lincoln was not the great emancipator and savior of enslaved people.
Indeed. And then I see here in the chat, Sister April has stated that Frederick Douglass was instrumental in changing his mind. We can actually thank Douglass. Absolutely. I think that's a really good point that's often overlooked. So as we get into the end of the war, you know, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, this took place April 9th of 65. This effectively ended the war. But once again, because Texas was so large and it had been pretty much isolated from a lot of battles, there was really a need for Union troops to come to Texas, because the Emancipation Proclamation, like you stated, Baba Aundar, it really didn't have any effect unless it was backed by troops. And so when the troops came in, then it was, you know, a greater likelihood that the Emancipation Proclamation would take effect. I see here in the chat, yep, there's a misconception about Honest Abe. Absolutely. And so when troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, it was June 18th, 1865 at Galveston Bay. And we know that it was there where U.S. Major General Gordon Granger issued General Order Number 3, which informed the people of Texas that all enslaved people were now free. This was on June 19th, so this is our mark in time. But one of the things we like to point out is that Galveston is off the southern coast of Texas, and Texas is a massive state. So when you talk about a piece of information being read in Galveston, I mean, we didn't have the internet at that point in time. It's going to take a lot of effort for that news to leave Galveston effectively and then travel to other parts of the state. So thoughts on that, Baba Aundar?
No, I think I agree very much so, brother, because I would imagine just to get it to Houston, that takes time. And of course, when you look over to Wichita Falls, El Paso, Austin or San Antonio, And then if you have obstacles or people trying to stop that information from being spread and shared, you can imagine, yeah, it might have been announced June 19th, but when did people actually learn and hear about it? That might have been months later, 3 or 4 months later, because they said that there are those who knew about it, but they didn't inform those enslaved persons, enslaved Africans on these plantations, because they wanted to make sure they continue to labor and work, and harvest. So that's one thing. But the other thing I've heard rumor of, and I think it was in Galveston, some of those Union soldiers were Black soldiers. And they made a point of making sure they rolled out, traveling across Texas, sharing information about the General Order Number 3 and the end of slavery. So you can imagine, I would kind of picture, it was a struggle just to get the word out from those who wanted to get the word and share it, as far as those Black soldiers and others, and those who wanted to, of course, to stop that sharing of the word, So, but I think it's important that we recognize that it took time for this to really take effect, and for all those who were enslaved to find out this information or become aware.
Indeed. And I see Ms. Brenda Clark in the chat here has put Ulysses S. Grant was married to the daughter of a slave owner. I think that's definitely worth noting and pointing out as well.
Mm.
And so we, just want to summarize and emphasize that June 19th is more of a mark in time, more the beginning of the end, because it definitely did not free everyone instantly.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we like to do is actually take a look at the reading of General Order Number 3, what the document actually states, because that in itself is telling. And so it says, the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Now, we would love to hear what you all think in the chat when you read this. What language stands out to you? What tone does this take? What's the underlying message? And I see Sister April here in the chat, employer and hired labor. Indeed, it's interesting that they choose these terms. It's also interesting that they don't lay any framework for how this transition is supposed to take place. What's your thoughts when you read and see this, Aundar?
Brother, when we first came across this information, I thought it was appalling, brother, to think that coming out of slavery, you're telling people that they're free, but you're also advising them to go create some kind of work relationship with those who had them enslaved. So imagine how that's going to work out. And then to suggest that, remain quiet, don't make any noise, don't fuss, just go back to the plantation, stay on the plantation and work. But then also to let people know, don't come to the military post because we're not helping. You're not going to get any handouts here. So stay on the plantation. And then to suggest that people idleness, brother, people been working for 240 something years. And now you're going to tell people not be idle. I don't think people were looking to be idle. They was just looking to have a fair deal when they worked, So I think the language itself, in a way, sets up a roadmap for the future challenges and struggles for free people. Because in this right here, it's basically saying you're free, but you're not free.
I didn't notice this until a few days ago. I've read this so many times now as we continue to teach it. But notice how it says former masters, but it never says former slaves. That right there reveals the mentality. And, you know, another thing that I always looked at is how the only responsibility is given to the freedmen. Absolutely no responsibility given to the people who were considered masters at that time. It's nothing that they need to do. It's no changes they are said that they need to make. Only the responsibility is given to the freedmen. So those are two things that I started really kind of honing in on in my last few times reading this.
That's an excellent point. You know, I'm curious, for those who are on with us, who was familiar with General Order Number 3? And if so, when did you become aware of General Order Number 3?
And I see Sister April in the chat. She mentions, I went to Texas public schools and never heard of General Order Number 3 or Juneteenth. I don't think that you're alone in that upbringing. I don't know that I ever heard about it either. Now, I didn't go to school in Texas. However, I would have been pretty certain that I would have recalled if I had heard something about General Order Number 3 and what took place with, you know, with the history of emancipation in Texas and Galveston. I don't think I ever heard that either. But once again, we're always curious what you all think. If you have any feedback about the General Order, or like Baba Aundar asked, how many of us knew about this before or during school? Let us know in the chat.
And I just add this, brother, and that's that I think this is another point where, you know, we talked about that representation of honest Abe, but I think sometimes we give a lot of emphasis to General Granger, and as if, again, it was this magnificent savior coming in and freeing Black people. True enough. As a matter of fact, well, I understand he didn't read the order. Someone else read the order, but I understand he brought the order, delivered it. But the idea is that I think when we talk about Juneteenth and the story and the narrative, very little do we mention others. Like, we don't mention the 180,000 Black troops who fought in the Civil War, you know, for freedom, and very much was instrumental in the Union winning the war. We don't talk about, sometimes I think it's important to talk about those who came before the war. I mean, if you really want to talk about war, we can talk about Nat Turner and his role. We can talk about Haiti and their role in all this, because really it's always been a war. But I'm just saying, I think sometimes we mention Abraham Lincoln and General Granger, and those are the two when it comes to Juneteenth celebration. And I think we have to be very careful with doing it in that way, because we lose light and sight on those who worked and fought and died to free themselves.
Excellent point. And so as we continue on, we know that there were these transitional type slavery institutions that went into effect and flourished after the Civil War. These things included sharecropping, the Black codes, the convict leasing system. And so even after enslavement, there were still these pitfalls, you could say, that kept us trapped, and not just in physical bondage, financial bondage, a limit of our mobility, things put in place to stop our access to capital, to stop our growth and development. And so we're going to watch 3 short videos that are going to go in depth with these systems that help to maintain the status quo of domination in the South. And so let's start with sharecropping. And so we're going to watch this video, and then we'll come back and watch the other 2.
But what exactly is sharecropping? Sharecropping is a legal arrangement in which a landowner rents land and resources to a farmer tenant and receives a portion of the crops produced on that land as payment. It existed in various parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia, but became especially widespread in the American South after the Civil War. Sharecroppers usually paid landowners with half to 2/3 of the crops produced. In addition, a share was sometimes given to local merchants who provided food, tools, and other resources to the tenants. While this system may seem mutually beneficial, it was often used to exploit formerly enslaved Black Americans. In fact, sharecropping became so widespread because white plantation owners had large amounts of land with no workers, and newly freed Black farmers had very limited skill sets and options for work. Sharecropping creates an imbalanced power dynamic between landowner and tenant, not only due to the historical context, but because it is remarkably easy to take advantage of farmers trapped in this system. For example, landowners often artificially inflated prices and charged high interest rates. If the prices were disputed, they'd threaten eviction, which left farmers powerless, especially if they had families to provide for. In addition, farmers with unpredictable or irregular harvests were at a significant disadvantage and were often kept indebted. So although they have been freed, Black sharecroppers were kept tied to the land they worked on and remained under the power and influence of the white landowners, which is precisely why sharecropping in the American South has been largely considered simply another form of slavery.
All right, and so she basically let us know that this was considered another form of slavery. So once again, a financial bondage. Such debt was created from sharecropping that people could never escape the plantation. I see here in the chat, Sister Clark, I did not attend school in Texas. I never heard of General Order Number 3 or Juneteenth until I moved here. In South Carolina, we celebrated Emancipation Day on January 1st. In current day, both Emancipation Day and Juneteenth are celebrated. Excellent point. And once again, January 1st for a lot of communities because of the release of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st. And so as we move on, we're going to watch a short video just speaking about the Black codes. So let's watch this one.
Almost immediately, most former rebel states enact harsh laws known as Black codes.
The Black codes are laws designed to regulate the lives of Blacks, in particular to control their movements throughout the South and to force them back onto the plantations as farm laborers working for the white landlords.
Some codes prohibit Blacks from owning firearms, buying liquor, or engaging in any trade or business other than farming. The land promised to the freedmen is returned to unrepentant rebels, sentencing Blacks to a landless existence for generations to come. Often, white landowners would hire freed slaves to work the harvest, only to chase them off the land when their wages came due. Unable to collect their meager earnings, many Blacks starved to death.
Johnson looked the other way as these ex-Confederate governments reimposed stringent controls over the Black race through the Black codes, which were a de facto form of slavery in that they regulated the daily lives of Blacks, much like apartheid in South Africa.
All right, and so there we have the Black codes. Once again, laws and regulations, a lot of times on a municipal level, that limited freedom, that limited mobility, that made it very easy for Black people to be arrested. Thoughts on the Black codes, Barbara?
I think pretty much you captured it, brother. I mean, it just made, again, reinforced the overall law that being Black is illegal, you know?
True. Very true. And so the last component that we're going to watch a video on is the convict leasing system. So let's go ahead and take a watch.
The labor system that took shape in the late 19th century developed coercive means to ensure that cotton remained king. It was called convict leasing. Get arrested on a minor charge or a trumped-up charge, you could find yourself locked up and then hired out to a corporation bidding on inmate labor. The pipeline from prisons to profits in this country has deep roots.
The aftermath of slavery was in some ways worse than slavery itself. Unlike before, when someone who owned you, driving you too hard was counterproductive because you would lose your investment. Convict leasing was different. You could get them cheaper, And if you actually drove them to death, there was more where that came from.
In the 13th Amendment, which ends the institution of slavery, of course, there is a loophole. Convicts who have been convicted of a crime, they actually can be forced to work for free.
In Alabama in 1850, 99% of the people who were incarcerated were white. In Alabama by the 1880s, 85% of the people incarcerated were black.
You know, I had read a statistic and it is said that in Alabama also during this time frame, over 70% of Alabama's revenue for 1 year came from convict leasing. That's appalling, but it just lets you know how profitable this system was. Wow. Thoughts on that, Baba Aundar?
You know, that last part right there, just to see from 1850 to 1880. But it made me think about, you remember we worked on the presentation put together, the lynching of Black America, where prior to the end of slavery, most of the lynchings that took place were white men were lynched. After the end of slavery, then you start to see most of the lynching are Black people, you know. So you see that same shift, of course, in this convict leasing. But the idea is that, brother, this is just another form of enslavement, you know. And one thing I always took, I guess, kind of looked at, brother, it's almost like from, you know, enslaved people were, Africans were enslaved on a personal level because, you know, you had these personal owners, enslavers. It's almost like they just shifted ownership to the state and federal government, you know, because now all the ownership is, you know, through the government, but it's still a form of enslavement, you know. So I see convict leasing just another form of enslavement, as it's been stated.
Indeed. You know, and I think that it's really worth mentioning how these three things work together. So sharecropping kept you in financial bondage, and also really encouraged people to stay on the plantations, which was mentioned in General Order Number 3. Once you tried to leave the plantation, because remember, in one of the black codes that the gentleman mentioned in the video, just doing work outside the plantation, outside of farm work, could be considered illegal in some places. So anything other than farming crops for a landlord could ultimately probably get you arrested. And then once you're arrested, you're going to be sent right back to a plantation owner now working for free because of the convict leasing system. And now they can profit from this. So it was just a cycle, just a detrimental cycle that put us in a position where we could never escape.
Point.
And so we know that one of the reasons that the convict leasing system was made possible was because of this loophole that exists within the 13th Amendment. Now, you know, we talked about how there was still enslaved people in Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and also Delaware, those border states. The Emancipation Proclamation had no effect there, so it was still a need for a federal law to abolish slavery across the board. And so when they proposed the 13th Amendment, you know, it was ratified in December of 1865, but that's months after June 19th. And so it wasn't until December that some people were still getting indication of their freedom in other parts of the country. And so the 13th Amendment, if you've never read it, it states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, what's your thoughts when you see that, Baba Aundar?
You know, as you said, brother, I think it's very deceitful, brother, honestly. I think there was honest, conscious intent to use this and establish this 13th Amendment as a way to, of course, announce the end of slavery, but also to set up that loophole, as you just spoke of, to re-enslave people. Because, again, if you can, you know, claim that they have committed a crime and found them and convict them of the crime, then basically you have control over them or you have re-enslaved them. And as Ms. Clark saying, beginning of mass incarceration of Blacks. Exactly. And this has been an ongoing issue because if we look at the numbers, brother, I think we'll be amazed, in a sense, saddened by the fact that how many Blacks have been in prison. And we see that number still high to this very day based upon our population, percentage of population in America. But this right here was the beginning of that in establishing, that whole system, as you just spoke of, convict leasing. This was it right here, brother.
And so I don't think it takes too much research to realize that there is a deep connection between enslavement and incarceration, both bondage. And I don't think it's by happenstance that you notice that was going back to the convict leasing video, that the prison population really started to shift to being primarily Black, especially in those southern regions. But I wanted to kind of touch on something that you just mentioned, Baba Aundar, that I think is very important. The fact that this loophole proves a premeditation, that this was thought about beforehand. Because why else would you put this in here if you didn't intend on using it? And why, with the 13th Amendment, the same amendment that you're using to outlaw slavery, you allow slavery in certain institutions or in certain settings, which mean you're not really abolishing slavery. You're just shifting where it can take place, which shows a premeditation, a forethought that that you still want this to at least have the possibility to exist in the nation.
Excellent. Good point.
And so we really want to hear what you all have to say. I know here in the chat, Sister Clark pointing out that the beginning of mass incarceration happens, at this point, it really begins. And so we always like to mention if we have new people that are joining us that are not familiar with our presentations, we often mention how if you want to learn more about this topic, the connection between enslavement and incarceration, if you've never seen the documentary 13th on Netflix, that's a absolutely brilliant piece of work, a great resource to learn more about this topic. Also, we like to point out the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is also a really good resource if you really want to dig deep into the incarceration enslavement connection. Another thing I want to point out that we don't often talk about is that the U.S. in general makes up a small portion of the world population, but houses 25% of all prisoners. So we have an incarceration problem across the board in general here in the United States, but then it gets extremely detrimental when you talk about the way that we incarcerate Black people, men and women. And so just wanted to point that out too, that the U.S. has 25% of the world's population that is incarcerated, which is sad in itself.
I when you raise that up, I've heard someone refer to it with the founding of the country as a criminal enterprise. Because when you think about the founding members of this country, first of all, those who were released out of prisons of Europe and England came to this country, established this country on definitely an illegal, unlawful, deceptive way, in the sense of, claiming that people are inferior and enslaving people, removing people from their land, though they might make treaties with them, and then they tear up the treaties and then still remove the people, take the land. All I'm saying, in point blank, is that it was set up in a criminal way because it was lying, stealing, and killing. And I think we have seen that continuously through history, that has not changed. So when you just brought up the fact of the number that are people, when it comes to the world population and how many people are incarcerated or in prison here in America, it has not changed because you set it up in that format in the first place, that you was going to criminalize people because it was set up by criminals in a way to keep that going. So I think we have to look at, last thing I see on that, brother, I think it just demands that we really go back in and reestablish, if we are to make a better world and better space, we're going to have to, in a way, break this down and reestablish it on principles of truth, justice, and righteousness. And we're not there yet. And in the way it's been going the past, hundreds of years, I don't know if we ever get there, but I'm always, hopeful.
Indeed. And so I think that's where we're at with the history. Hope that you all found value in the information shared. We're going to stop our screen share, but we still want to field questions, comments. If you all continue to have thoughts, feedback, anything in particular that stood out or that you would like to express, let us know. We're still here. And so just want to extend that to you all. Thoughts, Baba Aundar?
I do want to say this, brother, because I think what you just laid out in the slides there really shows that though we came to this point of Juneteenth, freedom, emancipation, independence, self-determination, we can see very clearly it wasn't just a clear path to freedom. It hasn't been, and we're still on that journey to freedom. If there's a place in space that we're trying to get to. But the idea, and this is what I raise up, that should be really considered in our celebration of Juneteenth, is the resilience, the determination, the reclaiming of our humanity and continue to raise up humanity, because I think we have been at the forefront for whatever freedom that has been given and brought forward here in America. As African Americans, we have been at the forefront of leading that struggle for freedom. And I think that's when we celebrate Juneteenth, we should know the history, know the continuous struggle, and to know that we have played a significant role and must continue to play a significant role in that journey towards freedom.
Excellent point. And I was going to pull up this quote because I wanted to read it. And I'm trying to find it okay. And so this comes from Coretta Scott King, and she says, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. And I think that too is a great summary of what we should be walking away with, because at the end of the day, each generation is going to have their own struggles with maintaining and attaining sometimes what we consider freedom. So to think that it's a destination and not a journey is probably maybe not the best way to look at it. And I really, really think that Sister Coretta Scott King hit the nail on the head with that quote. And I think that's why every generation, every so often, we see these cycles and we go back to struggling for certain freedoms. And I think that is very telling, that coming back to the summer of 2020 and how that uprising, that struggle for freedoms, and how people were really taken to the street is where we got the recognition of Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, as an actual federal holiday, so that it really tells us and it shows us that struggle is continuing and does continue over generations.
Excellent.
I see here in the chat, excellent presentation. Thank you. Absolutely, our pleasure. Great presentation as always. What a beautiful way to end Juneteenth 2024. Now we fight on that our voices be heard. Thank you so much. Absolutely appreciate that comment. Appreciate you all for always sticking with us. Any last words as we take it out, Baba Aundar?
As always, but I think it's important that whatever we learn, family, we share it with others. And we should make this a part of our tradition of celebrating Juneteenth, where we come together at some point on the day of Juneteenth or sometime around Juneteenth and talk about the history, because we need for our community, especially our young people, to know this history and understand that, Juneteenth is a marker in our struggle for freedom, but we're not there yet. And as Brother Logic just pointed out with the quote by Ms. Coretta Scott King, we all have a responsibility to continue to struggle each generation. So we have to pass that struggle down to the next generation. But we do it through educating them and making them aware of the origin of the struggle and the continuation of the struggle.
Indeed. So with that being said, family, we thank you for your time and your consideration. We appreciate you sticking with us through the technical difficulties as always. Those of you who were able to get through, appreciate your diligence to make sure that you could attend tonight. We know it's kind of a pop-up event, and so we really just want to thank you all. And we hope that you have a positive and productive evening. Happy Juneteenth to you all. And until we meet again, peace.
Peace, family. Thank you.